For decades, the United States ran an immigration system that strongly preferred Europeans, especially those from Northern and Western Europe. And then, in 1965, that system was dismantled. A lot of people still argue about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. What we're going to do here is walk through why it ended, what the old policy actually was, and the forces that made the change possible. Start with the background. In the early 1920s, America was dealing with the aftermath of massive immigration waves from Southern and Eastern Europe, plus earlier restrictions that had already targeted Asians. Congress responded with the Immigration Act of 1924, often called the Johnson-Reed Act. This law created the National Origins Formula. It set annual quotas based on the national origins of the American population as measured in earlier censuses, first 1890, then adjusted toward 1920. The practical result was clear. The vast majority of the limited visa slots went to people from countries like Britain, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia. Southern and Eastern Europeans got far smaller shares. Asians were almost completely barred. The Western Hemisphere was largely exempt from the quotas, which is why Mexican and other Latin American migration continued under different rules. The explicit goal of the law's supporters was to freeze the ethnic makeup of the country closer to what it had been before the big late 19th and early 20th century waves, preserving what they saw as the traditional American stock. That system stayed in place for roughly 40 years, with some adjustments. The 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as McCarran-Walter, kept the national origins quotas and even reinforced them, though it did end the total ban on Asian immigration by giving each Asian country a tiny quota of 100. Presidents Truman and later Kennedy criticized the system as discriminatory. Truman vetoed the 1952 law, but Congress overrode him. Still, the basic structure held. Europe first, and within Europe, Northern and Western Europe preferred. By the early 1960s, several pressures had built up that made the old policy politically and diplomatically costly. First was the Civil Rights Movement. The same period that produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 also produced a widespread view that government policy should not discriminate on the basis of race or national origin. Immigration quotas based on ancestry looked more and more like an extension of the same logic that had justified segregation. Lawmakers who had spent years fighting racial discrimination at home found it harder to defend a system that ranked entire nationalities. Representative Emanuel Seller of New York, who had opposed the 1924 quotas from the beginning, and Senator Philip Hart of Michigan became the lead sponsors of reform. They framed the issue as simple fairness. Judge people as individuals, not by the accident of where they were born. Second was foreign policy, especially during the Cold War. The United States was competing with the Soviet Union for influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Newly independent nations and non-aligned countries repeatedly pointed to American immigration law as evidence of hypocrisy. How could America claim to stand for freedom and equality while maintaining a system that treated people from India, Japan, Nigeria, or the Philippines as less desirable than people from England or Sweden? State Department officials warned that the quotas handed propaganda victories to the communists. After World War II and the experience of fighting against racial ideologies abroad, the national origins system looked increasingly like a liability on the world stage. Third was domestic politics. Large ethnic communities, Italian Americans, Greek Americans, Polish Americans, and others, had relatives stuck in long waiting lines under the old quotas while slots from Northern Europe often went unused. These groups had growing political clout. President John F. Kennedy had written and spoken against the national origins system, calling it intolerable. After his assassination, President Lyndon Johnson made immigration reform part of his broader domestic agenda. Johnson linked it to the same principles of justice that underlay the rest of his Great Society program. The bill that became the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, commonly called the Hart-Celler Act, abolished the national origins quotas. In their place, it created a preference system that prioritized family reunification and, to a lesser degree, skills and refugees. It set overall numerical ceilings and, for the first time, imposed limits on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Each country outside the Western Hemisphere was given the same maximum of 20,000 visas a year. Immediate relatives of U.S. citizens were largely exempt from the numerical limits. The architects of the law believed the family preferences would keep the existing ethnic balance roughly intact, because most Americans at the time had European roots. Many members of Congress who voted for the bill said publicly that they did not expect dramatic demographic change. Johnson signed the law on October 3, 1965, in a ceremony at the base of the Statue of Liberty. In his remarks, he described the old system as a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice, and said the new law would ask immigrants not where they came from, but what they could do for the country. The law took full effect in 1968. What followed was not exactly what many of its supporters had predicted. Immigration from Europe declined as a share of the total, while immigration from Asia, Latin America, and later other regions rose sharply. Family reunification turned out to be a powerful multiplier. Once a few people from a new source country arrived, they could sponsor relatives, who then sponsored more relatives. The per-country ceilings and the overall numbers also interacted with economic conditions and chain migration in ways that produced larger and more diverse inflows than the legislative debates of 1965 had emphasized. So the European preference policy ended because a combination of civil rights ideals, Cold War foreign policy needs, and domestic ethnic politics made the old system untenable. By the mid 1960s, the national origins formula looked, to a majority in Congress and to successive presidents, like a relic that contradicted America's stated principles and damaged its international standing. Whether that judgment was correct and whether the consequences have been net positive or negative remains a live argument. But the reasons the policy was repealed are clear from the record of the time. The country decided that selecting immigrants by national origin was no longer defensible. That's the history. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, consider sharing it or dropping your thoughts in the comments.